That's your private jet?" The laughter rolled across the executive terminal like a ripple through still water, drawing curious glances from travelers, pilots, and airport staff alike. Marcus Williams stopped walking. The worn canvas bag hanging from his shoulder rested against his side as he slowly turned toward the voice. Morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Falcon Ridge Executive Airport, casting long golden reflections across the polished marble floor. Standing near the private terminal entrance was Richard Collins, the airport operations manager. His navy suit looked freshly pressed. His silver name badge gleamed beneath the overhead lights. Around him stood several employees carrying tablets and radios, all waiting for his next instruction. Richard looked Marcus up and down, his eyes lingering on the faded jacket, the work boots, and the canvas bag that appeared older than some of the luxury cars parked outside. Then he chuckled again. "Sorry," Richard said, though his smile suggested anything but apology. "I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. You're here for the Gulfstream G700. A few staff members exchanged amused looks. One covered her mouth to hide a smile. Another glanced through the glass wall toward the sleek, white aircraft parked on the tarmac nearly 200 yards away. The jet shimmered beneath the clear Texas sky, its polished exterior reflecting streaks of sunlight like liquid silver. Marcus followed their gaze for a moment. His expression never changed. "Yes," he said calmly. "I'm here for the Gulfstream." Richard laughed louder this time. The sound echoed through the terminal lounge. "That's incredible." More heads turned. A businessman carrying a leather briefcase paused near the coffee counter. A flight attendant stopped mid-conversation. Even the receptionist behind the desk glanced up from her computer screen. Marcus remained still. His fingers tightened slightly around the strap of his bag, but his face revealed nothing. Years earlier, reactions like these might have unsettled him. Today, they felt familiar. Richard stepped closer. "Sir, access to that aircraft is restricted to authorized personnel and ownership representatives." His voice carried enough volume for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm going to need verification before we go any further." The terminal seemed quieter now. Curious eyes lingered on Marcus. Some looked sympathetic. Others simply watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Outside, the jet sat motionless beneath the bright morning sun. Beyond it, aircraft moved across distant runways, their engines humming like distant thunder. Marcus slowly nodded. "That won't be a problem." Richard's smile widened. "Good." He folded his arms. "Because that airplane belongs to people operating at a very different level." The words hung in the air. A subtle silence followed. Marcus looked past Richard toward the large terminal wall where decades of airport history had been displayed in framed photographs. One image caught his attention immediately. An old black-and-white picture. Construction crews standing beside unfinished concrete foundations. Hard hats, dust-covered boots. Men building something that would outlast them. Marcus stared at the photograph for a second longer than anyone noticed. Something quiet passed through his eyes. Then he looked back toward the manager. Richard was still smiling. Still certain of the judgment he had already made. Still unaware that before this day ended, everything he believed about the man standing in front of him would be turned completely upside down. Richard glanced toward one of the security officers standing near the entrance and gave a subtle nod. The officer remained where he was, but the message was clear. Nobody was going anywhere until questions were answered. Marcus noticed the exchange without reacting. His attention drifted back to the old photograph mounted on the wall. The glass covering the frame reflected the bright terminal lights, but he could still make out the faces beneath the dust and grain of the decades-old image. Men standing shoulder to shoulder beneath an unfinished steel structure. Workers whose names most travelers would never know. Builders, welders, concrete crews. Men who arrived before sunrise and left long after sunset. Men who created something that others would eventually take credit for. Marcus stepped closer to the display. The sounds of the terminal faded behind him. A memory surfaced. He was 9 years old again, standing beside his father outside a construction site fenced nearly 30 years earlier. The summer heat had been relentless. 98 degrees. The air smelled of fresh asphalt and wet concrete. His father, Daniel Williams, had pointed toward the growing airport expansion with pride shining in his tired eyes. "Most people will never know who built it," Daniel had said. "But that does not matter. Build it right anyway." Marcus remembered carrying a small cooler across gravel paths after school. He remembered watching crews pour concrete foundations that stretched farther than he could see. He remembered his father's hands, rough from years of labor, lifting him onto stacks of lumber so he could watch airplanes descend against the evening sky. Back then, Marcus had been fascinated by flight. While other children collected baseball cards, he collected aviation magazines from grocery store clearance racks. He memorized aircraft specifications. He learned the difference between engine types before most kids could ride a bicycle without training wheels. Every Saturday, he sat beside his father near the perimeter fence, counting arrivals and departures. Daniel never laughed at his questions, never told him his dreams were unrealistic. Instead, he answered every one of them. When he did not know the answer, he helped Marcus find it. Years later, when scholarships and opportunities finally arrived, Marcus carried those lessons with him. Engineering school, aerospace research, business ventures, long nights, longer setbacks. Success did not come quickly. It came through years of persistence that nobody celebrated, through risks few people understood, through sacrifices invisible to everyone except the people closest to him. A voice interrupted the memory. "Sir," Richard called from several feet away. "We still need verification." Marcus turned. The manager's smile had not disappeared. If anything, it seemed stronger now. The crowd nearby had grown larger. A handful of passengers waiting for charter departures lingered near the seating area. Employees whispered quietly among themselves. Curiosity spread faster than announcements in places like this. Richard adjusted his tie. "I understand you may be confused about terminal procedures." His tone remained polite on the surface. Beneath it sat something colder, something dismissive. "These aircraft represent significant assets. We cannot simply allow anyone to approach them." Marcus looked at him calmly. "I understand procedures." "Good," Richard replied. "Then you understand why this situation appears unusual." A few employees exchanged knowing looks. Marcus noticed one young baggage coordinator standing near the coffee station. Unlike the others, she was not smiling. She seemed uncomfortable, as though she recognized something unfair unfolding but lacked the authority to stop it. Marcus appreciated that. Quiet integrity was rare. Outside the glass wall, sunlight flashed across the Gulfstream's windows. A pilot appeared briefly at the aircraft stairs before disappearing inside. The sight made Marcus glance down at his watch. The crew would be preparing departure checks soon. Everything remained on schedule. For now, Richard folded his arms again. "Tell me something," he said. "If you are connected to that aircraft, why arrive carrying a bag that looks older than the terminal?" Soft laughter drifted from somewhere behind him. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly toward the canvas bag resting against his side. The fabric was worn. The leather straps showed years of use. Most people saw an old bag. Nothing more. Richard certainly did. But Marcus knew exactly what was inside. He knew why he carried it everywhere. And he knew that before this morning was over, the contents of that bag would matter far more than anyone standing in this terminal could possibly imagine. Marcus rested his hand lightly on the canvas strap and met Richard's gaze without irritation or embarrassment. The calmness seemed to bother the manager more than any argument could have. Richard had spent nearly 15 years at Falcon Ridge Executive Airport. He knew every charter company, every aircraft owner, every executive who passed through the private terminal, or at least he believed he did. His reputation had been built on appearances, expensive watches, tailored suits, luxury vehicles waiting curbside. In Richard's world, success announced itself before a person ever spoke. That belief had served him well, or so he thought. Looking at Marcus now, he saw none of the signals he trusted. No designer luggage, no security detail, no custom-tailored jacket. Just a quiet black man carrying an old canvas bag and standing in front of a jet worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Richard smiled politely, but his patience was beginning to thin. "You know," he said, adjusting his cuffs, "people often misunderstand how these facilities operate. They see an airplane and assume access is simple." Marcus said nothing. The silence encouraged Richard to continue. "The owners who use this terminal expect a certain level of security. That is why we verify everything." Nearby employees nodded. Some appeared eager to agree with whatever their manager said. Others simply watched. The young baggage coordinator near the coffee station lowered her eyes and focused on her tablet. Richard took another step forward. Most aircraft owners arrive through scheduled channels. Their staff notifies us. Their assistants coordinate details days in advance. He glanced toward the Gulf Stream visible beyond the glass. Especially aircraft like that one. Marcus followed his gaze. The jet remained motionless beneath the Texas sky. Ground crews moved methodically nearby. Fuel trucks had already departed. Everything appeared ready. Richard folded his arms. In all my years here, I have never seen an owner arrive like this. The words landed exactly as intended. Several listeners exchanged quiet smiles. Marcus understood what Richard was really saying. Not that his arrival was unusual. That he was unusual. The distinction mattered. A businessman seated near the lounge window leaned forward slightly, listening. Two pilots walking through the terminal slowed their pace. Conversations softened. Curiosity had become the dominant sound in the room. Marcus remained composed. Years of experience had taught him that some people revealed more about themselves in a single conversation than they realized. Richard continued speaking, unaware that every sentence was exposing his assumptions. You seem like a reasonable man, he said. So help me understand. Who exactly are you meeting today? Marcus looked at him for a long moment before answering. Someone important to me. Richard chuckled softly. That is not exactly a name. No, Marcus replied. It is not. The answer drew a few confused looks from nearby employees. Richard's smile faded slightly. He preferred clear hierarchies, clear explanations, clear categories. Marcus fit none of them. Across the terminal, sunlight shifted through the windows and illuminated the historical display wall again. One photograph caught the attention of an older maintenance worker who had just entered from a service corridor. His eyes moved from the image to Marcus and then back again. Something about the resemblance seemed to make him pause. He studied Marcus carefully, as though trying to remember something buried deep in memory. Before he could speak, a radio crackled sharply from Richard's belt. The manager answered immediately. His confident expression changed for the briefest moment. Not fear, not concern, surprise. Repeat that, he said. The voice on the radio responded, too faint for anyone else to hear. Richard glanced toward the terminal entrance, then toward the jet, then back at Marcus. For the first time since the encounter began, uncertainty flickered across his face. Whatever message had just arrived was not something he had expected. And somewhere beyond the glass walls of the terminal, a black SUV had just turned into the executive arrival lane. The black SUV rolled smoothly beneath the covered entrance and came to a stop beside the executive terminal doors. Several heads turned immediately. Falcon Ridge welcomed wealthy clients every day, but there was something different about this arrival. The vehicle carried no visible company logo. No chauffeur stepped out. No assistants rushed ahead carrying folders or luggage. Instead, the tinted rear door opened, and a gray-haired man in a charcoal suit emerged alone. The moment Richard saw him, his posture changed. The confidence that had filled his voice minutes earlier tightened into something more careful. "Excuse me for a moment," he said quickly before stepping away from Marcus. The crowd parted slightly as Richard moved across the polished floor. The older man entered the terminal with calm, measured steps. His eyes scanned the room once. Then they stopped. Not on Richard. Not on the gathering employees. On Marcus. The expression on the man's face shifted instantly. Recognition. Richard noticed it too. So did several employees standing nearby. Yet before anyone could process what they were seeing, the older man continued walking. Richard intercepted him halfway across the terminal. "Mr. Whitaker," Richard said with a practiced smile. "Welcome back. We were not expecting you until later this afternoon." Samuel Whitaker barely slowed. At 71 years old, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. His aviation company operated facilities across the country. His investments touched airports, logistics networks, and transportation systems in more than a dozen states. Richard knew exactly who he was. Everyone did. "Plans changed," Whitaker replied. His eyes remained fixed beyond Richard's shoulder, toward Marcus. Richard noticed the direction immediately. A strange feeling settled into his stomach. "Everything all right?" he asked. Whitaker nodded once. "That depends." The answer lingered. Richard forced a small laugh. "Well, if there is anything you need, we are happy to assist." Whitaker finally stopped walking. The terminal had become unusually quiet. Even the receptionist had stopped typing. Travelers pretended not to stare. Employees stood frozen beside desks and service counters. The older businessman glanced around the room before speaking. I understand there has been some confusion this morning. Richard swallowed. Nothing serious. We are simply verifying credentials. Whitaker's expression remained unreadable. Credentials. Standard procedure. Whitaker looked past him again. Marcus stood exactly where he had been moments earlier. Calm, patient, silent. The same old canvas bag rested against his side. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then something unexpected happened. The maintenance worker who had been studying the historical photographs slowly approached the display wall. He adjusted his glasses and looked again at one particular black and white image. His eyes widened. No way, he whispered under his breath. A nearby employee heard him. What? The maintenance worker pointed toward the photograph, then toward Marcus. That man. Several employees leaned closer. The image showed a young construction worker standing proudly beside unfinished concrete foundations decades earlier. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same calm expression. A murmur spread quietly through the terminal. Richard noticed it immediately. His attention bounced between the photograph, Marcus, and Samuel Whitaker. Pieces were beginning to move into places he did not understand. The radio clipped to his belt crackled again. This time the voice sounded urgent. Richard listened for several seconds. The color drained slightly from his face. Are you certain? He asked. The response came instantly. Richard ended the transmission without another word. His hand tightened around the radio. Across the room, Samuel Whitaker finally smiled. Not at Richard. At Marcus. A small smile. Respectful. Familiar. The kind shared between people whose history stretched far beyond a single morning. And suddenly Richard realized he was no longer controlling the situation at all. The silence inside the terminal felt heavier now. Nobody was smiling anymore. The employees who had quietly followed Richard's lead exchanged uncertain glances. The businessman near the lounge window lowered his coffee cup without taking a sip. Even the distant hum of air conditioning seemed louder against the growing tension. Richard cleared his throat and forced another professional smile onto his face. There must be some misunderstanding, he said. I am simply following airport protocol. Samuel Whitaker looked at him for a moment before turning his attention back to Marcus. Protocol is important, Whitaker said calmly. Assumptions are not. The words landed softly, but their effect was immediate. Richard felt every eye in the terminal shift toward him. He adjusted his tie again. The gesture had become almost automatic whenever he felt pressure building. His radio remained silent now, but the message he had received minutes earlier continued echoing in his mind. The Gulfstream's registration number had been verified. The ownership records had been confirmed. The information had come directly from the airport operations database. Yet Richard still struggled to reconcile the facts with the image standing in front of him. Marcus did not look like the people Richard expected to own aircraft worth tens of millions of dollars. That thought embarrassed him now, though he was not yet ready to admit it. The maintenance worker stepped closer to the historical display wall. I knew that face looked familiar, he said quietly. Several employees gathered beside him. He pointed toward the black and white photograph again. That man helped build this place. His finger rested on the image of Daniel Williams. My father worked with him for a few years. The older worker shook his head slowly. Everybody respected him. A young employee looked from the photograph to Marcus. The resemblance seemed undeniable now. The same calm eyes. The same steady posture. The same quiet dignity. Marcus glanced toward the photograph once more. For a brief moment, memories surfaced again. Long summer afternoons. Dust-covered work boots. His father's voice telling him that character mattered more than recognition. His father's belief that people should leave places better than they found them. Those lessons had stayed with him through every success that followed. Whitaker finally walked the remaining distance and stopped directly in front of Marcus. What happened next caused several employees to stop breathing for a second. The billionaire investor extended both hands. Marcus accepted them warmly. No performance. No display. Just genuine respect between two men who clearly knew each other well. You made it, Whitaker said with a smile. I would not miss it, Marcus replied. Not today. Richard felt his stomach tighten. You know each other? The question escaped before he could stop himself. Whitaker turned slightly. Know each other? A small laugh escaped him. Marcus and I have worked together for more than 12 years. The terminal fell completely silent. Richard blinked. Several employees exchanged stunned looks. The young baggage coordinator covered her mouth. The businessman near the window straightened in his chair. Nobody seemed prepared for what they were hearing. Whitaker continued. In fact, most of the expansion projects our company completed over the last decade would not exist without him. Richard's expression froze. Marcus remained silent. He never seemed eager to discuss his accomplishments. Whitaker knew that better than anyone. The older businessman looked around the room. There is something else everyone should probably know. Every eye followed him. Outside the glass wall, sunlight reflected brightly off the Gulfstream's polished fuselage. The aircraft seemed almost motionless against the blue Texas sky. Whitaker glanced toward it briefly before returning his gaze to the crowd. The reason I came here this morning was to meet the newest controlling investor of Falcon Ridge Executive Airport. The words hit the room like a sudden change in weather. Richard's face lost all color. Several employees stared in disbelief. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then Whitaker smiled gently and looked directly at Marcus. And that investor is standing right here. No one spoke. The words seemed to linger in the air long after Samuel Whitaker finished speaking. The newest controlling investor of Falcon Ridge Executive Airport. Standing right here. Several employees looked at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. The terminal that had felt crowded only minutes earlier now felt strangely still. Richard Collins stood motionless. The confidence that had carried him through the morning had disappeared completely. His folded arms slowly loosened. His shoulders dropped. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Marcus did not react to the announcement the way many people expected. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He did not remind anyone of what had happened earlier. Instead, he simply glanced toward the old photograph hanging on the wall. The image reflected softly beneath the morning light. Daniel Williams stood there forever frozen in time, surrounded by concrete forms, steel beams, and unfinished foundations. Marcus felt a familiar ache settle quietly in his chest. Not sadness, not anger, something deeper. Gratitude. He remembered the long drives home after construction shifts. His father exhausted but still finding energy to ask about school. He remembered sitting beside him in old pickup trucks without air conditioning, listening to stories about integrity, humility, and hard work. Most of all, he remembered something his father said during one difficult summer when money had been tight. Do not spend your life trying to prove people wrong, Daniel had told him. Spend it building something right. The memory settled over him like sunlight through glass. Around the terminal, whispers slowly began to return. Employees exchanged uncertain glances. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked thoughtful. The young baggage coordinator lowered her eyes, replaying everything she had witnessed since Marcus arrived. She realized that the only person who had remained exactly the same throughout the entire encounter was Marcus himself. The assumptions around him had changed. The facts around him had changed. But Marcus had never changed. Samuel Whitaker quietly stepped beside him. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Outside, the Gulfstream sat beneath a cloudless sky. Heat shimmered gently above the runway in the distance. Aircraft engines hummed somewhere beyond the terminal, creating a low, steady sound that felt almost peaceful now. Whitaker finally broke the silence. Your father would have been proud of this moment. Marcus looked toward the photograph again. I hope so. Whitaker nodded. He would have been. Richard heard the exchange. The words seemed to affect him more than the ownership announcement itself. His gaze drifted toward the photograph, toward the construction worker who had helped build the airport decades earlier, toward the sun standing before it now. For the first time, Richard began seeing the story behind the person he had judged. Not a title, not a balance sheet, not an aircraft. A person, a family, a legacy. The terminal doors opened briefly as a warm breeze drifted inside. The movement stirred the edges of a nearby American flag standing in the corner of the lounge. Sunlight shifted across the marble floor, creating long reflections that stretched toward the historical display wall. Marcus noticed the movement and quietly adjusted the old canvas bag resting against his side. He had carried that bag for years. Most people never asked about it. Most assumed it held ordinary belongings. Yet inside rested something he valued more than contracts, investments, or airplanes. something that explained why he had come to Falcon Ridge personally instead of sending representatives. His fingers brushed the worn leather strap. Then he looked toward the photograph once more. The terminal remained silent as he slowly began walking toward it. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke. Every eye followed him across the polished floor. And as Marcus approached the display wall, he reached for the zipper of the old canvas bag, preparing to reveal something that would change the atmosphere of the room once again. Marcus stopped in front of the photograph and slowly opened the canvas bag. The zipper moved with a soft metallic sound that seemed unusually loud inside the quiet terminal. Every eye followed the movement. Richard remained frozen several feet away. Samuel Whitaker stood silently beside him. The employees gathered near the display wall watched with growing curiosity. Marcus reached inside and carefully removed a worn leather binder. The edges showed years of use. The surface carried scratches and faded marks left behind by time. He held it gently, almost reverently, before opening it. Inside rested dozens of documents protected by clear sleeves. Old photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, construction permits, records most people would have considered worthless. Marcus turned one page and removed a single photograph. He held it up beside the framed image on the wall. A collective breath seemed to pass through the room. The photograph showed the same construction site from a different angle. Daniel Williams stood smiling beneath a steel beam while holding the hand of a young boy no older than 8. That boy was Marcus. Several employees leaned forward. The resemblance was unmistakable. Marcus handed the photograph to the maintenance worker. The older man studied it carefully before nodding. "That is him," he said quietly. "I remember this day." His voice trembled slightly. "Your father brought you here after school." Marcus smiled softly. "He did." The maintenance worker looked at the image for another moment. "Daniel used to talk about you all the time." A silence followed. Not an uncomfortable silence. A thoughtful one. Marcus reached into the binder again and removed another item. This time it was a folded blueprint. He carefully opened it across a nearby table. Several people stepped closer. The blueprint showed the original expansion plan for Falcon Ridge decades earlier. Certain sections were marked with handwritten notes. The handwriting belonged to Daniel Williams. Recommendations, corrections, improvements, ideas that eventually became part of the finished airport. Richard stared at the drawings. The realization slowly settled over him. The man he had dismissed that morning was not connected to the airport because of money alone. His connection ran deeper than ownership, deeper than investment. This place existed partly because of his family. Marcus gently touched one corner of the blueprint. "My father kept these documents for years," he said. "After he passed away, I found them stored in a box inside our garage." Nobody interrupted. Marcus continued. "He never talked about recognition. He never cared about plaques or titles. He only cared that the work mattered." Samuel Whitaker nodded quietly. He had heard these stories before, yet they still carried power every time Marcus told them. The businessman near the lounge window stepped closer. "Is that why you bought into the airport?" Marcus looked toward the photograph. Sunlight reflected softly across the glass frame. "Partly." He paused. "But that is not the whole reason." He reached into the binder one final time and removed a newer document. Unlike the others, this one was pristine. Fresh. Recently signed. Marcus handed it to Samuel Whitaker. Whitaker glanced at it before smiling. Then he turned toward the crowd. "Most people know Marcus as an investor," Whitaker said. "Some know him as an aerospace engineer. Others know him through his foundation." Several employees exchanged confused looks. They had never heard of any foundation. Whitaker anticipated the reaction. For the last 8 years, Marcus Williams has quietly funded scholarship programs for the children of airport workers across 5 states. The room fell silent again. The young baggage coordinator stared in disbelief. The maintenance worker blinked several times. Richard lowered his eyes. Whitaker continued. "Including this airport." No one spoke. No one moved. Then Marcus calmly looked around the terminal and said the words that changed everything once more. "There is a good chance that someone standing in this room today benefited from one of those scholarships without ever knowing where it came from." The words settled over the terminal like a quiet wave. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody laughed. The question hanging in the air was no longer who Marcus Williams was. It was whether they had unknowingly crossed paths with his generosity years earlier. The young baggage coordinator suddenly lifted her head. Her eyes widened as a memory surfaced. The Falcon Futures Scholarship, she whispered. Several employees looked toward her. Her voice trembled slightly. That paid for my first 2 years of college. Marcus turned toward her. The young woman blinked rapidly. I never knew who funded it. The application said the donor wished to remain anonymous. Samuel Whitaker smiled knowingly. Marcus simply nodded. The young woman pressed a hand against her chest. My mother cleaned terminals at Dallas Executive. We could never have afforded tuition. Emotion caught in her throat. I would not be standing here without that scholarship. Silence followed. Then another employee slowly raised his hand. A maintenance technician near the back of the crowd. My son received one too. A second voice followed. Then a third. Stories emerged from every corner of the terminal. A daughter who became a nurse. A son who studied engineering. A first-generation college graduate. Families whose futures had changed because someone they never met believed in them. Richard listened to every word. Each story felt heavier than the one before. He looked around the room and realized something that unsettled him deeply. The man he had spent the morning questioning had quietly invested in people for years without seeking recognition. Marcus had not purchased admiration. He had earned it. Richard lowered his eyes. The polished marble floor reflected the overhead lights in soft patterns. For the first time that day, he felt embarrassed by his own assumptions. Samuel Whitaker noticed. So did Marcus. The older investor turned toward Richard. You know what impressed me most when I first met Marcus? He asked. Richard looked up slowly. Whitaker continued. He never measured success by what he could buy. He measured it by what he could build. The words echoed the lesson Daniel Williams had taught decades earlier. Marcus glanced toward the photograph again. His father's image seemed almost alive beneath the sunlight reflecting across the glass. Richard took a slow breath. Then another. Finally, he stepped forward. The movement drew everyone's attention. The terminal became silent once more. Richard stopped several feet from Marcus. His voice was quieter now. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the certainty. Mr. Williams, he said carefully, I owe you an apology. Marcus remained still. Richard swallowed. When you walked through those doors this morning, I made assumptions about you before I knew anything about you. He looked briefly toward the old photograph. And I failed to show the respect that you deserved. The admission was honest. There was no excuse attached to it. No attempt to defend himself. Just truth. Marcus studied him for a moment. The room waited. Richard continued. I am sorry. The silence that followed felt different from all the others. Not tense. Not uncomfortable. Reflective. Marcus looked around the terminal. He saw embarrassed employees. Thoughtful faces. People reconsidering their own assumptions. Then he looked back at Richard. A faint smile appeared. My father used to say something, Marcus said. He believed every person deserves the chance to learn from a mistake. Richard listened carefully. He also believed that what matters most is what happens after the lesson. Richard nodded slowly. Emotion flickered across his face. Marcus extended his hand. Not as an owner. Not as an investor. Simply as a man choosing grace over resentment. Richard stared at the gesture for a second before accepting it. The handshake lasted only a moment, but it seemed to release the tension that had filled the terminal all morning. Around them, shoulders relaxed. Breaths eased. Conversations slowly resumed. Yet one question still remained unanswered. Why had Marcus chosen to purchase a controlling stake in Falcon Ridge now, after all these years? Samuel Whitaker already knew the answer. Marcus did too. And as his eyes returned to the photograph of his father one more time, he realized the moment had finally arrived to tell them. Marcus stood quietly before the photograph as the terminal settled into a different kind of silence. The tension was gone. In its place remained something deeper. Understanding. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows and painted warm reflections across the marble floor. Outside, the Gulf Stream waited beneath the bright Texas sky, its polished surface glowing like silver against the distant runway. Marcus looked at his father's image one last time before turning toward the people gathered around him. Employees, travelers, pilots, maintenance crews, reception staff. Faces from every corner of the airport now stood together listening. The reason I invested in Falcon Ridge was never the runway, Marcus said softly. It was never the terminal. It was never the business. Nobody interrupted. I came back because this place gave my father purpose. His eyes moved toward the blueprint resting on the nearby table. He believed airports were more than buildings. He believed they were places where people started new chapters of their lives. Several employees nodded. The maintenance worker smiled quietly. Marcus continued, "When my father passed away, I spent years thinking about what legacy really means. Eventually, I realized it is not about having your name on something. It is about creating opportunities for people you may never meet." The young baggage coordinator wiped a tear from her cheek. Others lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Samuel Whitaker folded his hands and listened without speaking. He had heard many executives deliver speeches over the years. Few carried the weight of truth that Marcus carried naturally. Marcus glanced toward the terminal entrance. In the coming months, Falcon Ridge will launch a new education and apprenticeship program for airport families. Several employees looked at one another in surprise. Marcus smiled. No child of an airport worker should have to give up a dream because opportunity feels out of reach. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Hope, excitement, gratitude. Richard listened carefully. Every word seemed to deepen the lesson he had learned that morning. Marcus looked toward him briefly and offered a small nod. Richard returned it. No further apology was needed. The understanding between them spoke for itself. Outside, the first signs of departure activity began around the aircraft. Ground crews moved efficiently across the tarmac. The distant sound of an engine start rolled softly through the glass walls. Marcus closed the old leather binder and carefully placed it back inside the canvas bag. The same bag that had caused so many assumptions only hours earlier. Then he lifted it onto his shoulder. The gesture felt symbolic somehow. A reminder that some of the most valuable things a person carries are invisible to everyone else. Samuel Whitaker approached and placed a hand gently on Marcus's shoulder. "Ready?" he asked. Marcus looked once more at the photograph. Daniel Williams remained there forever, smiling beneath unfinished steel beams, unaware that decades later his lessons would still be shaping lives. Marcus smiled back at the image. "Ready?" Together they walked toward the terminal doors. Nobody rushed after them. Nobody asked for photographs. Nobody demanded attention. The crowd simply watched. Respectfully, quietly, the automatic doors opened. Warm sunlight flooded inside. Beyond the glass, the runway stretched toward the horizon beneath an endless blue sky. Marcus stepped outside and paused for a brief moment. A breeze moved gently across the tarmac. Somewhere above, an aircraft crossed the sky, leaving a thin white trail behind it. He looked up and remembered being a little boy standing beside a construction fence, dreaming about airplanes with his father. Then he continued walking. Behind him, inside the terminal, employees slowly returned to their work. Travelers gathered their bags. Conversations resumed. Life moved forward. Yet something had changed. Near the historical display wall, sunlight settled across the photograph of Daniel Williams. Beside it rested the blueprint he helped improve. And reflected faintly in the glass was the image of his son walking toward the future he had spent a lifetime building. No applause followed. No announcement echoed through the terminal. Only the quiet hum of engines in the distance and the peaceful silence that remains when dignity, grace, and justice finally meet.